Okay, so now Jan Buterman will take us through the 3 possible citizen brain paradigms of personhood. Yeah?
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Appreciate you coming over today. So my name is Jan Lucas Buterman, and I am a student in this course. And the presentation I want to share with you today is called Citizen Brain, 3 Possible Paradigms of Personhood. So Canadian media theorist Marshall McLuhan said that we shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us. I suggest that the tools that we use to reshape ourselves may create unanticipated challenges for the assertion of agency by free people. Indeed, our conceptualization of the word person may need to undergo a fundamental change in policy and law. Interestingly, this change may be due both to the fantastic changes possible with mechanical technology, as well as the nuances of the technology of language. Personhood, sometimes distinct from and sometimes congruent with the notion of citizenship, has long been constructed through the technology of language. Personhood may be assumed to be a simple notion, one that is no longer troubled by legal fictions or structures that denigrate some humans to be less than others. Unfortunately, this is simply not true. Well, Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Many contemporary places and events demonstrate that who is considered to be a human being, complete with freedom and equality, varies widely. First, a disclaimer. I am not a lawyer. So, of course, this is not a substitute for professional advice. Use only as directed. Do not immerse in water. Avoid ingesting with complex carbohydrates. And, of course, void where prohibited. In other words, any egregious misunderstandings are entirely my own fault. Who am I? Well, my own location within this paper is that of a transsexed adult male who was terminated from a substitute teaching position with an Alberta Catholic Public School Board. The termination letter that I received stated that the teaching of the Catholic Church is that persons cannot change their gender. As I was and am changing my gender, I wondered if the reverse were true. Was I therefore not a person? My grandmother was in her teens before she became a person in the British Empire. The ability for the empire's first female magistrate to be appointed to Canada's Senate depended completely on the contested interpretation of the word person. Likewise, Jewish citizens in Germany had not done so well when they became no longer persons under what are collectively known as the Nuremberg Laws. More recently still was the practice of the state of South Carolina, where it did not outright ban African Americans from voting in state elections, but the requirement of voters to read and explain the state's constitution effectively prevented many people of color from exercising their franchise. In short, I have much reason to be concerned with how we have and will craft laws regarding the notion of persons and personhood. This crafting is intimately connected to using the technology of language. Language and its expression through writing is a key technology that has shaped Western notions of the world. According to McLuhan, writing brings uniformity, continuity, and homogeneity based on literacy, because literacy is a uniform processing of a culture by a visual sense extended in space and time by the alphabet. Thanks to the technology of writing, all manner of information and interpretation, including laws, can be brought forth into the world and remain in the world long past the lifespan of the writer. Again, for example, the struggle for women to be recognized as persons in the British Empire. Note that personhood conveys also some rights and responsibilities of citizenship, one of many concepts that is demarcated by limits of any given jurisdiction. Writing thus allows language to be a technology that can transcend human notions of timescales. Consider our own modern ability to read ancient texts of long-dead civilizations. The audiences these texts were written for may no longer exist, yet we are able to learn of the daily transactions of ancient civil and political life through the technology of language and writing. Beyond writing, language itself is a technology of substantial power. In the book of Genesis, a text that is still part of several modern faith traditions, it describes the act of creation as an act of declarative speech. Let there be light. Whether language is a technology exercised through speech or through writing, language is powerful indeed. One of our uses of the technology of language is to develop and enact laws. Law is a rule of conduct imposed by authority, and it is in force and effect within specific jurisdictions. A jurisdiction refers to both the law and the declaration of action, and incorporates notions of the extent or range of judicial or administrative power, and the territory over which such power extends. Jurisdictions may overlap. For example, Canadian cities are empowered to enact bylaws to govern their territories, but those bylaws cannot supersede provincial legislation such as education laws or federal legislation such as the Criminal Code of Canada. Even places that are not officially inhabited are subject to law. For example, both the Antarctic and the Moon are governed by international treaties that are used to govern they're governed by international treaties related to the use of those territories. The intent of this presentation is not to examine law in any great detail. In a very real sense, it would be impossible to identify and assess adequately all possible legislation currently in force and effect across all jurisdictions in all nations. The purpose of this presentation is to identify some questions that we may realistically face in the not too distant future, or perhaps even now. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a groundbreaking document outlining principles of human rights for people worldwide. However, the Universal Declaration itself is not legally binding. Instead, two other treaties combined together to form the International Bill of Human Rights. Those treaties are binding only to those states that choose to be signatories. The first treaty is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The second treaty is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. While the Universal Declaration of Human Rights conveys the principles of international human rights, these two treaties convey the specific rights and limitations of those rights. Together, these two legally binding documents comprise what is known as the International Bill of Human Rights. Both treaties begin by recognizing the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family as the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, recognizing that these rights derive from the inherent dignity of the human person. Additionally, both treaties state that all peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. These treaties use similar language to note that no distinction or discrimination is to be exercised against individuals for differences such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Among these documents, the language used remains framed in the context of the human family and human beings, despite allowing for differences in birth or other status. A person is a human being, and human means of or belonging to people, as opposed to either animals or God. A human may include also having or showing the qualities distinctive of or commonly applied to human beings. Back to a person again, a person can also mean an individual regarded as having human dignity, human rights, dignity, or worth. Additionally, a person can be an individual natural person or a corporate body as an artificial person, recognized by the law as having certain rights or duties. For the purposes of this presentation, I am addressing the notion of a person as an individual. I will not investigate the role of corporations as people. Even setting aside the murkiness that corporations bring to the word person, many questions arise about our assumptions of the meaning of the word person in an individual context. For me, some questions that arise when thinking about human beings and technology include the following. Are human beings iterative? Are we arising from something repetitive, such as repeated thoughts or actions in the world? For example, are we humans because we are, that is, that we embody the notion of to be and are always in the process of becoming? Are we additive? Are we arising from the accumulation of thoughts or actions? This means, are we humans because we continue to engage in the world until the point of death? Or are we possibly subtractive, arising from constraints or reductions of thoughts or actions in the world? Are we humans because we choose not to engage in thoughts or actions that could be construed as inhuman? The technologies of science and medicine only makes these questions yet more complex. Expanding knowledge about the inner structures of the human body allows us to realize that people have chromosomes, yet some people have an extra chromosome. People with heart problems may undergo a variety of procedures, including heart transplant from a human donor or an artificial heart. Some people may only require heart valve repair, which currently includes options such as mechanical valves or donor valves from humans, cows, or pigs. Some scientific discoveries in medical practices, such as insulin extracted from animal pancreases and catgut as absorbable sutures, are already commonplace and raise little ethical objection. But what of the incorporation of non-human tissues, particularly when religious values may limit contact with some species? Does the introduction of non-human or non-biological material render a person no longer a human? McLuhan notes that we use technology to extend our senses. We have eyeglasses that correct our sight, as well as telescopes and microscopes that extend our sense of sight to incredible limits. We have radios, phones, and network technologies that extend the reach of our voices and our ears, and with smartphone and tablet devices, that extension also includes our eyes. McLuhan said that the extension of any one sense alters the way we think and act, the way we perceive the world. Does the extension of our senses, possibly including the reduction or even elimination of our corporeal components, cause us to become something no longer human? Can a brain of any sort, in any substrate, be a human, a person, or a citizen? Science fiction explores many issues that arise when we consider the possibility of multiple paradigms of personhood, even when limited to stories that do not involve anything of alien origin. I found the following stories to be particularly insightful for the notion of personhood, but they are by no means an exhaustive survey of the genre. In Delaney's Nova, we're presented with a cyborg-enhanced population where nearly everyone, except the ever-harassed gypsies, is connected to their technologies through wrist sockets. Gibson's Johnny Mnemonic presents us with Earth and near-Earth populations with various extensions, including neural implants that extend data storage capacity and skeletal modifications such as retractable razor claws. Additionally, the story introduces us to a cyborg-enhanced and exoskeleton-armored dolphin. Smith's The Dead Lady of Clowntown depicts a far future, heavily populated galaxy that includes mouse brain-controlled robots, uploaded constructs of long-dead persons, a slave class developed from genetically modified animals, and people born only under computer-controlled population parameters. In All the Troubles of the World, Asimov presents us with a world computer that helps with all aspects of human life on our planet, including counseling and keeping personal confidences. Heinlein's accidentally aware lunar computer in The Moon is a Harsh Mistress likewise helps with all aspects of human life, this time for the penal colonists of Earth's moon. None of these stories hold simple answers for the problem of personhood. Personhood is troubled by the lack or presence of sensory or cyborg extensions, the role of origin in conferring equal rights and dignity, and the ability to exercise free will or self-determination. Delaney's gypsies are hounded from place to place in part because they cannot partake in typical educational processes that require direct cyborg-enhanced access to teaching technologies. Gibson raises questions over intellectual property ownership and third-party data stored in a courier's head, and the challenges of maintaining upgrades or feeding addictions with minimal resources, whether the person in question is of human or animal origin. Smith's underpeople are seeking kinship with their fellow beings, following the little dog girl toward a hoped-for freedom from slavery and arbitrary death. Asimov demonstrates that a purpose-built artificial intelligence may no longer wish to serve in the capacity for which it was commissioned and may take extraordinary means to end its servitude, even attempting to resort to assisted suicide. Heinlein suggests that even free will and personal agency may not save a powerful intelligence from substantial harm in the face of conflict. Each of these stories explores different rationalizations for demarcating between person and not person, for rationalities that can likewise be found in our nonfiction history of human oppression. These stories suggest that what defines human and person will remain contested, yet ultimately flexible. That while our technology of language may lie behind the ability for us to extend or even change our senses to entirely new and possibly non-biological states of existence, language is also capable of being stretched or reformed to fit these ever-changing needs. While the science fiction stories I outline are old, they suggest to me that in our collective contemporary future, if not now, we will need to rethink our notions of humanity and personhood. I suggest 3 general paradigms to describe possibilities for personhood that may not be met in the current language that is found in the 2 treaties that comprise the International Bill of Human Rights. In keeping with the challenges of language as a technology, it is important to note that I was unable to find a single descriptive term that already existed to describe 2 of the paradigms I'm discussing. Thus, I have attempted to modify existing language for the purposes of this presentation. The first is organism. The organism is a paradigm that begins under commonly held assumptions of the description of a human being. The organism may be unaltered in any way from its state at birth, beyond natural growth cycles, or it may include corrective measures such as wearing glasses, having dentures or other dental appliances, require the use of prosthetic parts, including limbs, breasts, or other body parts, alter or modify body parts for medical or cosmetic purposes, including but not limited to implants, whether from human or non-human biological sources, or from mechanical or synthetic sources. Could use organic or synthetic source nutrients, medications, or other substances to support life or cause temporary or pervasive change to the body, or other modifications, alterations, or adaptations for any purpose whatsoever. In short, the organism begins with little or no intrusion from artificial means. Even the conception and birth of the organism may arise from accidental pairing of gametes rather than from deliberate intervention. The amalgamism is a paradigm that begins with something that is not commonly understood to be a human in our time, but takes on the attributes of a human through genetic manipulation, technological or mechanical intervention, a combination of genetic and technological intervention, or other intervention with tissues or technologies. The first generation of an amalgamism cannot arise by accident. Deliberate, intentional decisions must be undertaken to bring the amalgamism into being. Synthesism. The synthesism is a paradigm that has no innate connection to biological organisms, beyond prior states of existence having been built by other organisms. While the synthesism may have components that mimic biological organisms, its structures are entirely synthetic and made from material other than biological tissues. A synthesism may arise from both deliberate intentional decision on the part of builders or through the accidental accretion of whatever elements need to be in place for consciousness and self-awareness to rise. These paradigms are theoretical conveniences only. Just as with contemporary medical practices of replacing heart valves, we should not assume that any supposed organism is purely human or purely non-synthetic. These paradigms also assume a commonality of some degree of independence and self-agency, whether that agency be in thought, word, or deed. Still, I must caution that we already run into trouble with such a definition, because if we consider the very ill human who is still alive through life support technology, although there may be no thought, no capacity for speech or action, are we comfortable claiming that such a person is not really a person, or that such a person is actually a deceased person merely because they cannot think, speak, or act? Another issue humanity must deal with is determining at what point a person becomes not a person. If we were to graph a continuum of a biological organism to that of an artificial synthesism, would a person who had a certain number of prosthetic or artificial parts no longer be a person? Is there some ideal optimization for what is or is not a person? If an individual artificial synthesism were to have a certain number of prosthetic or biological parts, would it become a person? Why couldn't a synthesism be a person in the first place? After all, we already use the technology of language to write laws that confer personhood on corporations. Yet another important issue lies in our current international human rights framework. If inherent rights of dignity and so forth rely upon the notion of being born, how will we recognize the rights of people who may not have been born, but made? Or people who have arisen fully formed, so to speak, out of the requisite precursors for self-awareness and consciousness? Would the origin of a person's components matter? Would organisms be inherently more dignified than synthesisms or amalgamisms simply because of the actuality or possibility of birth? Are these other paradigms of being not also to be accorded inherent rights of dignity? Note that in this discussion I have not explored additional complications, such as the notion of ownership. Who owns your genome? Who owns the rights to the components used to extend senses or replace parts? Do we have rights to ongoing maintenance of third-party components, or do we live under a limited warranty that may expire before we do? These and other questions related to the role of corporations as rights-holding bodies are important, but again beyond the scope of this brief presentation. The technologies of science and medicine have and will likely continue to revolutionize what is possible for the person. Looking at fiction as an exploration of the borders of personhood demonstrates that we will need to rethink our conceptualization of person in our technology of language as we continue to expand the boundaries of what a person could be, just as we have already done in a non-fiction context for all manner of rationalization for non-personhood, including sex, race, ethnicity, ability, and so forth. Legal language relying on terms such as human being or born may prove to limit rights that might otherwise be accorded to other beings. Regardless of the way that science and medicine may change our perceptions of personhood, we have substantial historical evidence that the technology of language itself will affect who will or will not be considered a person. Thank you for your attention today.
Okay, you have a voice again.
Okay, do I have a voice now?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is a very profound essay, I must say. And I wonder if I could offer some of my thoughts about it.
Absolutely.
I think it was Michel Foucault who said that language is always inefficient. And therefore, I think one thing that has happened in the 20th and what has elapsed of the 21st century is that we have used a language that people are not used to. And we attribute words and names to certain things that people have branded as evil in all its aspects, either socially or morally or whichever way you want. And therefore, they're incapable of accepting what is natural as something natural. So therefore, I think that's one of the main reasons why the issues of metaphors about illnesses, and of course I don't have to talk about Susan Sontag, everybody knows about that, but metaphors about illness have come about, and metaphors about war, which were the ones that were used before, have, because of the limitations of language, to this, those metaphors to describe things. And then the application of terminology to individuals alters what those individuals mean to society.
Absolutely.
And for example, the use of terms like gay or homosexual or lesbian or pansexual or sexual deviant or this or that or the other are all things that are limitations of the language, rather than something that you're describing that is inherently evil, even if some of those things are maybe dastardly. So that's one aspect of your essay that I think is very important to point out, and how you have these paradigms that you have created, I think serve a very good purpose as a comparative terminology, rather than as a taxonomic approach to anyone who is alive and walks and breathes. The other thing I would like you to think, I don't know if you mentioned this particular of course, Asimov is not Canadian that I know.
No.
But I think a main, what should I say, story that you should think of incorporating into your analysis is, of course, the replicants in Richard K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? The background for Blade Runner.
Yes.
Because there you have individuals who are perfect, okay? The only thing that is different from those individuals than from human life is that they're programmed to die and that they have no memory. So it's interesting that there again, because of that, they're called replicants. They're not considered to be humans. So there is some similarities between that fiction and what people are trying to do today of applying etiquettes to individual people, labels I meant, and try to have them behave according to some preconceived idea of what a person might or might not be. Mm-hmm. So those are some of my thoughts about your wonderful essay. I congratulate you.
Thank you. Thank you for the suggestion on the story. As those of us who read science fiction know, it's a massive genre. There were literally hundreds of stories I chose not to include. I agree that Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is a particularly good one. Another one that's similar but different would be Heinlein's Friday, where you're dealing with cloned organisms and whether do they have a soul? They weren't born. Do they have a soul? And there's some really interesting questions that are played through in those stories. And simply for limits of time and the limits of the assignment meant that I couldn't indulge myself that much. But thank you for the suggestion.
I was thinking that you might be able to turn this into a book. and then, of course, expand it. No, I really think so. I think that you have approached it with profundity, and there is a capacity to expand this into something much more detailed.
When I sent my proposal to Kim and also to my mentor, Professor Dr. Heather Graves, it sounded really great. And then as soon as I sat down to start writing it and then meet with Heather, I said, there's a problem this is a book. This is not an essay. So I did run into that exact problem. And who knows, if I can get myself organized, I think it would make a very fascinating exploration. And thank you for the insight and the suggestions.
Yes.
Oh.
Okay.
Thanks, Dan. That was really good. I found your comments on language particularly interesting, especially in light of your struggle to find the right words to describe what you were trying to describe. And I'm wondering if, because inherently language is open to interpretation, if having the Universal Declaration of Human Rights written in language sort of flaws it. Is that flawed? And do you think that someday we'll move beyond language to a more efficient and less open to sometimes incorrect interpretation form of communication?
Excellent question, and again, lots of good exploration of that, both in fiction and in theory. I always forget which one, if it's Plato or Aristotle, but one of them complained bitterly about this newfangled invention of language, of writing language, because they said we won't learn anything anymore, we won't know anything, because all you have to do is write it down, and you don't have to actually know anything yourself to be able to function in the world. And we've had, a few hundred or 1,000 years since then to explore that problem, and I would say there is some truth to that, and maybe it's only escalating now that no one needs to know anything as long as you can Google it on your tablet or your smartphone, right? It adds different layers to that. But I think I would suggest that whenever we put words out there, we have intentionality behind whatever we're coining or however usage is happening, but language is also use. So how we use words does change over time. And one of the reasons that I sourced the Oxford English Dictionary for the words I was using is that I really need to see exactly how this word has been used over the last 1,000 or 2,000 years, and it does that. It's the one dictionary I know of that will give me the first instance of use in the English language, and then when the meaning starts to shift in terms of how we use that language, it'll then show you the next instance in print over sometimes thousands of years worth of sources. And I find that really helpful. Unfortunately, it also makes it very slow to write a paper because I get lost with all those fascinatingly interesting things and trying to find the words to describe the paradigms. For example, I ran into the same problem. I mean, I could easily spend days just playing with thesauruses. I'm quite happy happy with that. But I think it's also fascinating how much is embedded within our language. So, do we often think much about corporations being people, for example? If we really think about it, well, so are we going to let corporations vote? Are we not? We don't necessarily trouble those ideas very much, even though they may have force and effect, that there are laws that have enabled those things to exist in the world, and we kind of participate in that fiction or that agreement that this is what this means. But we do see shades of difference all the time, and if I can share a medical example, I remember being a cancer patient and happening to have a substitute oncologist because mine was ill and was gone for a bit, and made some comment about a particular medication possibly causing bone density problems. And I said, well, but is it just that particular one, or is it everything in that class of medication that can cause that problem? Because this is a small dose I'm taking here. Years ago, I took huge doses of a sister drug to that. He said, oh no, you better get your bones checked. You need to check that out because this stuff is really hard on your bone density. And I said, well, but before I started chemo, you guys did all those scans and things. You did a bone scan. You said my bones are great. He said, well, we don't have the technology to scan bone densitometry. We were scanning for other things to see if you had cancer in your bones. Well, though I feel I'm a fairly knowledgeable patient, I had no idea that a bone scan is not a bone scan is not a bone scan. And so subsequently, I will not mix up the kind of scanning done for an oncology purpose versus a bone densitometry test. But I'm sure that everyone thought we were all talking about the same thing, but what I heard was not what was being said. And you don't even necessarily recognize at the time that that's something you should explore further. So I think that we will always have room, I guess, for interpretation. And I think that perhaps that's where our poetry may come from, is we have that flexibility. But it's also where sometimes some of our challenges, as our online guest here has said, we find that may be where we get a lot of our conflict and misunderstanding from, because we're not speaking, we may think we're speaking the same language, but we're just not. Thank you.
So do you have further comments?
I wanted to also say that the polarization has occurred with language, so that the moment that political and ideological feelings have become part and parcel of the language that we hear every time. It is different when you had to read things. Now you hear everything, and you interpret what is said by who is saying it. And things are attributed to the language that are not necessarily what the language means. So that also has complicated the idea of personhood and the objectivity that people should have towards other fellow beings. And I think that also should be perhaps brought forth in your essay.
Thank you. I agree. There's a lot of plasticity in meaning, and again, even when we supposedly share the same language, we can make huge interpretive gaps. But also when we share languages that may have similar or completely divergent roots. I mean, many of us who come from languages that come out of Western Europe have lots of shared language because of roots of Greek and Latin, but new layers of challenge come in and complexity come into when you have languages that come from completely different areas and have entirely different associations connected to them. Everything from how time is understood, to how action is described, to how we even refer to each other. Do we have pronouns in a language or do we not? All of those kinds of things affect how we can communicate about something. And I think one of those things that's interesting for us as people, at least, is that experience of attempting to learn a different way of communicating challenges us on so many levels, I think in part because we start going, wow, even our own language is maybe not so clear as we assume when we just grow up immersed in it. But I do think those are all issues that relate to this kind of problem.
In science and medicine, English is so widespread, and then you have the other major languages of Spanish and Japanese, Chinese. But when you get beyond that, like I had a good friend who was Danish, and he talked a lot about how in medical circles in the beginning, you feel so stupid because you have this extra barrier of language, and it's a minority language. Not many people speak Danish, and so it's such a relief to get back home and be able to speak your native language again, and then you have to go back into a situation. Now, you must have some insights about that, having written in both English and Spanish a lot.
Yes, most definitely. When I started going in the 60s to Spain, I was one of the few people who could go there and speak in Spanish about things that were being developed in my specific field, nephrology. And I felt like a little bit of an oracle, so I was a little wary of what I said and how I said it, because there was such limitations from my colleagues of hearing what I had to say and being limited by the fact that they could not read English well or speak English well. So absolutely, there was a time that was a major barrier for people to feel that they were participating on scientific discoveries and scientific developments, at least in Spanish and English.
Yes. So it gets very exciting here in about 2 minutes. This room will hold about 400 people. The next class is about 400, so this huge horde starts coming in. But I want to thank you very much for taking part in this very important day. It's probably the most unique and pivotal day of the entire course. And I'll write to you about what you thought further about this, and it's been very valuable to have you as a part of today. So anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Yes.
Thank you.
So just to reiterate, you know that I'm an amateur poet, and in any group of physicians, there are not very many real poets. Manny is a real poet. He published his first poetry book in 1986, and I think he's the only person in renal medicine who is a bona fide published poet, a real one. So I used him as my mentor and so on for poetry. He was a very prominent physician, and then recently he's become much more focused on poetry and novels, and that's an interesting change. A lot of people in medicine didn't know where he was anymore, but I found him. So anyway, thank you very much for taking part in things. Okay, well, this is the last day of the course. Thank you all for having taken part. I hope you will stay in touch with us and encourage others to take the course and give me ideas about speakers and subjects for the future, and anything else you may wish to give me ideas for. Anyway, thank you very much, and thus ends today's session. Thank you, Manny. Bye-bye.